I've said before, I was once asked by the media at Queen's Park what the hardest thing was you had to do in business, the hardest decision you had to make. And there's no question, it's terminating somebody's employment. It's easier, I think, if somebody's stolen money or physically abused a fellow employee or whatever. But even then, I think there's a small part of all of us that worries about that person's ability to provide for their family and that sort of thing, even if they've made a bad mistake. But sometimes it's just the right thing to do, to terminate people, not because they're bad in any way at all, but because their time has passed, or in some cases their time never arrived. That means the hiring was a mistake, which of course bosses never admit, but you say their time never arrived, or that it's just time for a change, because that can happen in all kinds of jobs, including, in this one. I mean, one day, guy just disappears. One day you just won't hear my voice anymore. Whoop, time for a change. And hopefully they don't throw you out of the second floor of the condemned towers, but that can happen. And it's not always good advice, but I can tell you one of the rules they teach, not in business school for sure, but just in business, is to hire slowly and fire quickly. If you do more of the former, hire carefully, you'll do less of the latter, meaning having to fire at all, let alone quickly. It was in that context, I guess, that I did not oppose the termination of Gary Webster as the boss over at the TTC. He was a veteran. He'd been there 16 years. He's a decent man, no question about that. He engaged in absolutely no wrongdoing whatsoever. But you know about this kind of instance, as that veteran of many years, part of the wallpaper of the TTC after all those years, was he the man to fix the TTC, to renew an organization that certainly looked flabby and lacking in accountability? Well, those of you out there in business will know that it's a rare bird indeed who is capable of successfully being the agent of change, responsible for changing the things you put in place. It's just a matter of human nature. You're not inclined to see either that something you brought in has passed by its best by date, or that it's not working anymore because you brought it in. You're more inclined, not everybody, but you're more inclined to defend it. At the TTC, I believe, and I don't know what you think about this, I believe customer service a la 2012 was not a way of life. Projects were over time and over budget routinely. And the idea of lean management seemingly being embraced over there just wasn't a reality. And I'm not saying that's because people deliberately made things over time and over budget or deliberately produced bad customer service. It's just, I think, sometimes that you get so settled in, you don't even recognize that customer service has run downhill. I mean, honestly, when you compare the incredibly modern, efficient, self-serve ticket dispensing machines, those of you who've traveled anywhere, I always think of London, England, because they've got this great system where you punch in where you're going, you put in the coins, and it gives you a ticket right then and there. You don't talk to a human being. Here, we have this system where you go up and give your money in at the little window, and the guy's behind there, and then he puts in his hand. If you buy, I think it's now, 7 tokens for $14, or no, it's 7 for $20, whatever. But you buy the tokens, and I buy the tokens, and he puts in his hand and then drops them into this little dish, and you pull them out of there. I mean, what kind of a ridiculous system is that in 2012 in a huge, cosmopolitan world city like ours? You can see how far we've fallen behind. And that's not Mr. Webster's fault entirely, but if you want to make a change and invigorate the organization with that desire for change, then somebody like Mr. Webster has to go, the guy at the top. One of the other things you have to think about when you let somebody go is who will replace them. I don't believe Mr. Webster's termination was solely or even principally motivated by his lack of support for subways. That's what they, created into a big foo-for-ah when he got fired. I think the timing came about because the commission did not follow rule number 1 that I said you don't learn in business school: fire quickly. I can tell you for a fact that the Ford administration overall had concluded a long time ago that they needed to make a change at the top, not because Mr. Webster was a bad guy, but just because he wasn't the guy to bring about the kind of change they thought needed to be brought about at the TTC. And they didn't do that rule number 1, hire slowly and fire quickly. Now, what evidence backs up my claim that Mr. Webster was done like dinner months ago? It's the fact that his successor, who we're going to talk to in a minute, was hired months ago. You don't just bring in a dynamic leader with senior experience in London, England, and Sydney, Australia, so he can sharpen pencils for the guy who's staying in the top job. Andy Byford, he won't say this, he's too polite and too decent, but he was brought here to be the boss. And from my exposure to him to date, and what I've heard him say on the media and so on, he is a smart, no-nonsense, hands-on, senior transit executive who knows, what the TTC needs, And he knows as well that really what it needs more than anything is that it was formerly tops in its class, that it slipped down the ranks and is no longer as good as the city it serves. Again, he's too polite to say it that bluntly, but he knows that's the challenge that's in front of him, and that's a big challenge. Andy Byford is the Chief Executive Officer of the TTC and freshly confirmed in that job with a title change. And I was discussing it, Andy, with... thank you very much for coming on, by the way.
Hi, John. How are you?
Good, thanks. I said, I guess incorrectly, that the TTC had thought of this because they thought it was important to clarify that you are the top dog, as it were, but I gather you, how did that come about?
Right. Very simply, John, that I specifically requested that the title be changed to Chief Exec, not because I'm overly hierarchical or because I'm sort of egotistical about these things, but to me it was hugely symbolic because what it's saying very clearly is two things. Number one, we are a new management team and we mean business, and we can come on to that and the sorts of things that I think we need to address. But number two, I think Chief Executive Officer is better understood by people out there. Chief General Manager seemed very stuffy, very sort of old school. This is a more modern concept, but also it says, I think quite clearly, I am accountable and you can hold me accountable, because that's what happens with CEOs.
Having been a CEO of a big company, I completely agree. I mean, the buck stops with you, and there's days you don't like it, but it's very clear to people, it's very clear to the team, and it's very clear to you that there's nobody to look behind or above. And I think it also, and I ended up talking about this with your chair, it also makes that role clearer too, because the chair of these organizations, just like the chair of a big company, is not supposed to be running the place. She doesn't want to run the place. She wants you to run it.
Exactly.
And they're supposed to be overseeing you on behalf of the shareholder, which in this case is the taxpayers.
Exactly right. And I think there needs to be that clarity. I'm a great believer in what I call single point accountability as well, which is one of the things that I think the TTC desperately needs. And by that I mean stuff that you'd know, John, as a former CEO. You need to have a vision. You need to have key performance indicators that will deliver that vision. Everyone within the TTC, top to bottom, needs to know what we're striving towards by way of corporate goals, translated ultimately into individual targets, and there needs to be accountability and single point accountability so that I've got a go-to person for every key performance indicator. So anything that's not on target or is trending adverse, something needs to be done about that. Corrective action needs to be taken. That's the kind of discipline that we're introducing.
And are you going to do that with, we're not talking yet much about transit, but I think these things are so vitally important to getting good transit. Are you going to do something about the compensation? Because I don't know particularly about the TTC, but much of the public sector, they do have bonus schemes, so they had the right idea, but it was often not based on really measurable things where you said, look, you either did it or you didn't. All the kind of feel-good stuff, people got bonuses for people feeling good, as opposed to saying, look, the trains either ran on time or they didn't.
Sure. At the moment, we don't have such a scheme. I think at the moment, I don't think we should be costing the taxpayer any more, so I don't advocate that right now. I think that as we regain the confidence of stakeholders, of customers, of the media and other observers, then as and when we've regained that confidence, that's something that we might like to do. It can be a very useful tool. It's not the only motivator. I'm a great believer, John, that success is actually a huge motivator. And in my short time here, one of the things I've tried to do is demonstrate to my team that, yes, we've got lots of great things on the horizon, big projects, the Spadina extension, Presto, the new Toronto rocket trains, that's all good. But in the meantime, there are things that are just not good enough that I call mediocre. Things like dirty trackside walls, handwritten notices on collector booths, garbage traveling up and down on the trains all day. So we had a real blitz on things like that, and there's more to come. And actually, the staff have responded to that really well. They like to know where they stand. They like clear direction, and they also like to see the fruits of their labor. And I put that success back to them, not me.
We're going to be talking later this afternoon about the sort of relative utility of unions nowadays, and just that, whether they're adapting to changing times. You've obviously probably had to deal with unions, certainly in Britain and in Australia, I presume, and you're going to have to deal with one here. And I actually have quite a bit of respect for Bob Kinnear as a guy who kind of talks straight and so on. Have you had a sit down with him as yet?
I have, only last week, in fact, and I share that respect. I think Bob is a straight talker. That's what I like. I'd much rather deal with someone with whom you know where you stand, rather than some sort of sort of sneaky sort of disingenuous way of working. With Bob, you know exactly where he's coming from, and I welcome that. I can work with him. That we won't agree on everything. When I had my coffee chat with him the other day, we even said that. What I've flagged very clearly is there will be change, but in making those changes, I do respect that the unions have a role, and that I am obligated to consult and in some cases negotiate on those points. That's not to say, though, that things can't change, and I think Bob's enough of a realist to know that things have moved on. We're in 2012. Some things do have to change as we embark upon this all-out top